Hello all together. I'm very happy to be here. I'm retired for many years, and this conference kind of brought me back into the linguistic scene. I also realized that many years ago, I'll mention it later, I was dealing with issues that were well received but not really picked up, and I felt like, well, now it's the moment to talk about it. I will change a little bit what I prepared, because here we are more in the art center, not so much in the linguistic scene. I want to, spoiler alert, say something about the title of the conference. I don't really know about hope. I don't know whether I have hope or not. What I want to promote is to talk more about joy, communicating joy by enjoying what is there and observing more, observing better, but also to express grief and mourning about what we see getting lost. And I found these examples here very inspiring. But first, I just want to go a little bit back. Reculer pour mieux sauter. I was thinking about our own history, let's say linguistic history, and reflect about how our own thinking about language does affect culture in a way that it furthers this alienation that we all, or many of all, see at the basis of this project, of this process of ecological indifference, or as Bruno Latour says, the tragedy of indifference. If we go back to the beginnings of more or less modern linguistics, it started with a very balanced image, very balanced idea of language. I'm a big fan of Wilhelm von Humboldt, and I see someone smile. It was completely balanced. It had nothing to do with the idiotic image of sender receiving, as if communication, you can put it into a parcel and then receive the same message on the other side. So there's nothing like a continuous progress. You can also get more stupid than live more. It's an organic vision, because it takes into account the entanglement, the interdependence of all the levels, and also the co-responsibility of the speaker and the recipient. So there's it didn't start with a naive idea about what meaning is and what speaking is. When it got further into, and I think it's just not by accident, when it got further, that was like around 1800s. And then when the industrialized civilization got more and more influence on thinking, the bias between these polarized but codependent elements got more and more onto the side of the mechanical, the formalized, the mechanical. And what I want to focus on is the fascination with the notion of arbitrariness. Arbitrariness, I'll get into that, I think is one of the fascinations also of the powerful ideas of our mechanical, also digitalized culture, it is not just an innocent term. Of course, part of some aspects of arbitrary of language, of course, you can call arbitrary, wherever you call it a t-shirt or a table, you know. But I want to get after Humboldt. I want to, and I used it as a title. I want to get this to this famous sentence of Chomsky. Maybe there are not many Chomskyans among us. I still want to fight him, you know. And this famous sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. We all know this sentence, or most of us. It was meant to show, to exemplify the independence of meaning and context, because it's a sentence that's still grammatical, colors, green ideas, sleep furiously. But what does it prove? If now I decide to look at it as, say, poem or symbolic message, it's not so senseless, it's not so silly. It's skillfully produced. It's not like arbitrarily thrown words together. It's very skillful because it has 3 contradictions in 5 words. Colorless green, sleep furiously, and ideas sleep, ideas not supposed to sleep. It's a smart construction, but it underrates our intelligence because we know the context where this sentence was constructed. So the human insistence on finding meaning must not be underrated. So I just decide to make meaning out of that and read it as an oracle. And I could think, well, maybe have our green ideas been too colorless? Have they been sleeping too long? Maybe they should wake up. It shows that, I want to abbreviate a little bit, not to go too much into linguistic history. It shows that in this model, in the old, let's say, mechanistic models of linguistics, there was enough sufficient simplification that made it attractive for mechanical modeling of grammaticalness. So it paved the way for computer linguistics, in spite of the fact that Chomsky's model was not very useful, not functioning all too well in that way. But it was it was one of the factors that were enabling digital society. With all its advantages, I mean, we're all using it. However, the costs of these advantages were not very well thought about. There have been linguists in that period, maybe some of them remember the work of Delheims or Michael Halliday or J.R. Firth, who had a much broader vision of language with a less impoverished idea, where meaning and context were much more strongly included. In a lecture, I just recently listened to a recording of a lecture of Michael Halliday, where he talked about fashionable linguistic notions and talking about so-called arbitrary sign systems. He called arbitrary a silly word. I found that quite funny. This seems just like a historical view back, but I do think that our way of thinking about language, we all know how deeply language and cultures are entangled. So I do think that our linguistic models, or at least the basic ideas that we spread about what language essentially is, do have or did have an influence on our culture and are a little bit co-responsible also for ecological indifference. So what I want to ask here is, why do we call our languages natural language? Because in ecology, we talk about nature. What is so natural about in language, in natural language? One thing, of course, is languages are not man-made. They're not a fabricated object. They're also not a smart contract consciously signed, like, you know, these thoughts about contrat social. Human languages are this absolutely ingenious system that is able to use and unify polarities of all kinds. Humboldt, for instance, was talking about the solid and the liquid, or about light and warmth. So there are so many other polarities one could bring there, that right and left hemisphere somehow, and they are completely, they are completely inseparable, but in our concept about, in our thinking about language, there was this increasing bias on the purely cognitive side, on the stable, on the solid side, on the mechanical side, on the arbitrary side. On the arbitrary side, that means it has no connection. It has no connection, particularly to our senses, or emotional nature, and to our physical, sensorial, corporeal nature. Both sides, of course, of this polarity between arbitrary and non-arbitrary are essential for language. But the problem is the balance got lost. What makes arbitrary so attractive? The notion of arbitrary, or the technical aspect of arbitrary. Arbitrary means I can choose, I can decide. It seems coherent with our industrialized culture, where control, individual power are important, and it has this connotation of freedom, of feasibility. I can call my dog whatever I want, you know, don't ask the dog. I was rereading recently good old Ferdinand de Saussure, but he was definitely a genius, linguistic genius, no bad word about him. But rereading it, it struck me how, I mean, all these technical, systematic explanations are perfect, but there was an emotional thing about it, where he talked about the arbitrary notions, the arbitrary character of the connection between the signifier and the signified. There's, for some interesting reason, he didn't just present it in a neutral way, but he was like arguing and also reducing the notion of motivated, like non-arbitrary, to a very, very small example, like to onomatopoetic expressions, where the sound really imitates like meh for, children's language for sheep. So then it's easy to say, of course, that arbitrary, non-arbitrary connections between sound and meaning is like something completely marginal. Let's not forget that the polarities between arbitrary and non-arbitrary, discrete or digital and analog, quantity and quality, these polarities are closely related. The useful property of money, that it can be used for anything, that's like the arbitrary advantage. At the same time, it has no connection whatsoever to our value systems, other value systems. I mean, money is an absolutely quantifiable issue. It's numbers, but it has no relation whatever to, say, the value systems like ethics, aesthetics, or life, quality of life. So if that arbitrary notion is your focus, then the qualitative dimension is automatically marginalized. So what gets me closer to the things that have been presented, that is the notion of poetry. Not poetry just in a narrow sense as we know it, but the notion of the poetic. In poetry, the arbitrary notion, the arbitrary quality of language that is always to some extent there, is systematically reduced. The philosopher that has been mentioned by Noel this morning, Bruno Latour, was more and more insisting on, let's say, the existential value. He asked, what is the responsibility of the arts towards science and society? I think we can ask, what can a kind of language like poetry and poetics teach us that the modern scientific mainstream neglected? If we go back to the question, what's so natural about natural language? I think we can say that the creative potential is one of the main factors that justify us to call our language natural language. Here, our cognitive, sensorial, also aesthetic, and emotional intelligences, we have more than one, are intimately connected and enhance each other in the most productive way. I mean, we all know that poetry develops or demands specific modes of awareness and interpretation skills, the inventive use of analog qualities, multiple layers of meaning, also can teach us how to deal with limits of understanding. We can also enjoy, let's say, with songs, we can also enjoy things we only half understand. Okay, I have to skip a little bit. I don't need to prove how in poetic language, in a larger sense or in a poetic way of looking into the world, the arbitrariness is reduced, and it feels through it the entanglement of all our intelligences and also entanglement of the elements that are used. There is a kind of motivated, rounded, unified experience about what we read or hear. What's so natural about languages? Unfortunately, they're so natural that they can die. What brought me into the ecological discourse was the shock to learn how many languages have already died. And I do think that all linguists should engage more in the defense or in the activities, the activism for endangered languages. I read in the newspaper 2 years ago, I just want to finish with this because that really motivated me emotionally to get more into action. A short notice appeared in 2022. In the Brazilian rainforest of the region of Tanaru, the last survivor of a small tribe was found dead. For 30 years or more, he has been living completely alone in the forest. Imagine, 30 years. The last 6 members have been murdered by gold diggers and aggressive rangers. We know neither his name nor his language. He's been fleeing deeper and deeper into the forest, avoiding any contact. Even though the Brazilian Agency for Indigenous Cultures, they were kind of aware of him. They called him El Indio do Buraco, the whole man, because in every one of his temporary shelters that he kept building and then had to leave again, there was a deep hole neatly dug into the ground. No one knows what for. Around August 22nd in 2022, he was found dead in his hammock, his body decorated ceremoniously with colorful bird feathers, as if he had seen his death coming. Somehow this image of this man who had for 30 years no one to talk to, but only no one to live with, shook me away. And I want to make you aware of who, if you are not yet, of the various societies for endangered, dead and dying languages, because they're quite active in focusing on, as far as you can do, on political interventions to slow down, because, of course, languages die when their speakers die, but their speakers die when their environment dies. So I want to finish just with an obvious consequence. A poetic way of being in life, bioaccumulata would call it as ethics of entanglement. This kind of poetic consciousness makes an appeal to the intelligence of the senses. And I think this is what we have to communicate more than just, let's say, scientific facts. Also, what is intrinsic to the poetic way of life is that there's no boundary between inner and outer life. And I think that goes to a deeper level of how to be present, how to be aware, how to be there. It also relates to the experience of beauty. I'm not talking about, I don't dare to talk about hope, but I talk about beauty. Beauty is such a strong force, even though it cannot be financially quantified, and that's why we have so many ugly buildings, for instance, but it's such a strong power that we miss a big chance to communicate if you do not include this more strongly into our way of communication. We have to enhance, or we can help to enhance also our openness, our awareness, and our capacity for this, and feed our joy, curiosity, and sense of wonder. We have to make it contagious. So we should not only insist on renunciation of some consumer good, but on the gain we can have by a better, a more poetic way of life. It is really more fun. So I would, with a pun for the linguists among us, put poetics in a wider sense, perhaps serve as a bridge between the famous sentence of Ferdinand de Saussure, La langue est un système où tout se tient. The language is a system where everything is kind of in mutual balance. To le monde est un système où tout se tient. The world is a system where everything is in interdependence, in balance. So, thank you.